So good afternoon to all the participants who have joined us now. My name is Arnold Tsunga. I'm a member of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum that are hosting this webinar today. And it's part of a series of webinars that we're going to be holding on elections and the rule of law. And it's very consistent with the primary objectives of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, which is a regional rule of law and development organization. So before I introduce the speakers, what I want to do is to ask Brian just to give the audience who are here the way in which we are going to roll out the webinar, and especially with the focus on the logistics around how we will track questions that are coming from the audience and how we will structure the processes to try and ensure that all the questions are answered, but that we give as much opportunity for participation as much as is possible. So Brian, maybe you can quickly get into that. I'm also informed that one of our resource persons is running late, Honorable Tendai from Zimbabwe, so he will join when he gets here. And so over to you, Brian, on the logistical components.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been informed that in some parts of Africa, we're afternoon, in other parts we're morning. So I'll say good afternoon and good morning. As Arnold has introduced, this is the second installment in a series of 5 webinars that the Africa Judges and Jurists is hosting through the generous support that has been granted to it by the people of the United States, citizens of the United States, through a grant offered by USAID. The series is looking to explore elections and the rule of law and touches on a number of issues. We've looked at the right to participate, and today we will look at the electoral environment within the context of the COVID pandemic that we are all experiencing. The way that the meeting will be structured is that we will have Arnold Tsunga lead us through the processes as our moderator. We have a panel of 5 who will speak in turn, and this will be followed shortly after with a question and answer session. The question and answer session will utilize 3 ways or methods of getting your question across. We have, if you look at the bottom of your panel, question and answer tab. If you click on that, you will be able to ask questions to the panelists and to raise issues with the meeting. We also have on the same panel, you have the ability to raise your hand. There is a palm symbol at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you'll be able to grab the attention of either myself or Victoria, who is also assisting with the identification of raised hands. And we have a chat platform as well. So you have 3 ways that you can raise your questions. If you have an issue or a question that you want to raise as the panelists are speaking, I recommend that you put that in the question and answer session, and we'll attend to those as soon as the speakers have all finished their contributions. That's all I wanted to say at this stage, Arnold. I will leave the proceedings to you, and I hope we'll have a wonderful meeting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Brian, and really wish to welcome the participants who have joined us. So as Brian said, this is the second session of a series of webinars that the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, in collaboration with the collaborating partners that Brian has already stated, which would include IFES. And this time we're going to be looking at the question of creating an even electoral play field in the context of COVID. I think all of us will know that with the declaration of COVID as a global pandemic that was done by the World Health Organization on the 11th of March, many countries, virtually including all in Africa, declared a number of legislative measures under either the state of declaration of disaster or a declaration of state of emergency. And the effect of those declarations was that it allowed for states to impose what I would call lockdown measures that had the effect of limiting enjoyment of fundamental rights, you know, like expression, association, movement, protests, for example. And these fundamental rights are so critical to the enjoyment of civic space. And civic space is so fundamental for people to be able to engage with matters that affect them, including being able to make proper decisions that affect them, and holding those who are in positions of public office to account for the way in which public affairs are run. So I think the principle of accountable governance is one of those that has been sort of threatened by the COVID itself. So, and in a number of countries, the UN has lamented that the COVID measures have been used as a pretext to clamp down on civic space and to limit the enjoyment of democratic participation. And yet we are in a situation where in a number of countries we are going to have elections because of the fact that as the AU instruments show, the will, the authority usually is derived from the free expression of the people's will that is expressed through free, fair and credible elections. So I think this takes me to the question of introducing the wonderful panel that is going to interrogate with us the topic for discussion. So we do have Honorable Dr. Miria R.K. Matembe, who is the chairperson of the board of the Citizen Coalition on Electoral Democracy in Uganda. So, Honorable Doctor, welcome to this panel. I'm very pleased to see you.
Thank you very much. I'm the chairperson for Citizens Coalition for Electoral Democracy called CEDU.
Perfect. You are looking fabulous and ready and raring to go, chairperson. Then we will also have Honorable Sam Alufandika, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Malawi Electoral Commission. Honorable Alufandika, it is such a pleasure to have you on this panel. And
thank you so much. By the way, I'm not honorable, so I don't want to assume that title.
Okay, we will.
I'm just an ordinary person trying to manage elections in Malawi.
With honor, indeed. You've really managed them with honor. So I think the fact that we're beginning to confer you informally with that status is an act of appreciation of the way in which you did it very well, you know, first time around. So welcome to the panel, Chair, CEO Sam Alufandika. Then we also have Lucianna Wambui Thuo, and we had also decided to confer with an honorary doctorate for purposes of this conversation. But then she says, don't do it yet, because I think in a few years we have given a very good premonition for that title. So welcome, Lucianna, to the panel. Then
Thank you.
we also have Leah Mitaba from Zambia, who is the head of Secretariat for the Zambia Council of Social Development. I'm hoping that Leah has joined us. I didn't see her earlier, but yeah, she's here. So Leah, welcome. She's a very tenacious human rights defender in Zambia and operating in a very difficult context. So I think this topic is one which was really designed for the Zambian electoral environment. I really look forward to hearing from Leah, especially given the similarities in the contexts between essentially Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi before Alufandika fixed it, Kenya and Uganda. And then last but not least is going to be Honorable Tendai Biti, who is a member of parliament in Zimbabwe and the deputy president of the opposition movement for Democratic Change Alliance. So he said that he's running late and they've had visitors from South Africa, envoy that was sent by President Ramaphosa because of the disturbances that have sort of taken place in Zimbabwe. So I'm hoping that he can join us. If he doesn't, then we'll see as the participants are presenting, we will try to see if we can get anyone from Zimbabwe giving us their view. So without wasting too much time, let me start by asking Mr. Sem Alufandika, the Chief Executive Officer of Malawi Electoral Commission. I think it's natural to start with you because frankly speaking, I never thought you were going to make it. The time frame looked impossible. The electoral arrangements in terms of the preparedness, given the fact that you were implementing essentially a court-ordered election, the toxicity of the political relations among the contesting parties, the seeming unyielding determination on the part of the incumbents to ensure that they could throw everything in the way to prevent the commission from being able to level the playing field and make the participation of Malawians meaningful. And then add to that the COVID, the COVID environment. How did you make it?
Thank you so much for giving me yet another opportunity to make a very short presentation on this topic. I think to add on the list that you presented, because you have done quite a good background for me on my behalf, but to add to that, I think it's a question of the commission changing 2 weeks before polling day. We had a new commission, and that was part of perhaps the puzzle. So I just wanted to add that one. But suffice to say that, yes, indeed, Malawi implemented a presidential election, which was court-ordered, and we are taught to deliver and ensure that a candidate is announced or declared winner within a 150-day period. That was the challenge, but we had to comply to the court order. So the first thing we did was to ensure that all the issues that were raised within the court determination have been addressed before implementing the fresh presidential election. That was very important because we didn't want a repeat of what we had in 2019. So the Electoral Commission ensured that we addressed all the issues, as many as they were, to ensure that this is done. Apart from that, as you've said, there was the COVID situation. which you highlighted. And we had to also ensure that we implement the process amidst the COVID-19 without really compromising the process, one, and compromising the health of the people of Malawi. So just as a background to the COVID situation, I think before the hype of the retroactivity, we had very few cases. For example, the first case we had was on 2nd April. As of 20th June 2020, there were only 358 total confirmed COVID-19 positive cases, with just 4 deaths. And then after the implementation of the electoral process, a few weeks down the line, by yesterday, 9th August 2020, there are 4,658 COVID-19 positive cases in Malawi and 146 deaths. But the argument is we cannot directly attribute these cases to the retroactivity. There may be other issues as well. One of them, the importation of positive cases from South Africa. Those Malawians who were sent back to Malawi from South Africa and were tested positive upon entry. So it's very difficult to attribute this 100% on the electoral activity that we had in June. Having given that short background, I just wanted to focus on what I'm here to say, the issues. I think to summarize the issues that may affect the level playing field during the implementation of an electoral process under the COVID-19 environment, I wanted to say this. The first issue is voter information and education. The second one is campaigning by political parties and candidates. The third one, electoral participation, both by candidates as well as the voters themselves. And perhaps finally, the electoral observation process. You know, all these have a bearing on the level playing field and electoral integrity. First, let me expound on the voter information and education as implemented by the electoral management bodies in most of our countries. You know, the Malawi experience was that we had to abandon the traditional ways of voter information and education and focusing on the online ones, the radio, the television, social media, and that has an impact in a country like Malawi where 80% is rural-based and does not have access to internet, access to radio, access to television. So in a situation where political parties have, some of them a rural-based powerhouse, and some of them urban-based support, then the level playing field there is not guaranteed, because those with urban-based support will have an edge over the rural-based support because of this situation. So our voter information, yes, was not as favorable in terms of level playing field. And that is also likely to be the case with campaigning. You know, campaigns mostly are to do with the human interaction. And most countries that are affected by COVID-19 pandemic, their preventive measures are that human interaction should not be there. And that affects campaign processes. So if indeed campaign processes have to be restricted to online means, and you minimize human interaction because you cannot gather, for example, more than during the implementation of Malawi elections, there were restrictions of a gathering of not more than 100 people. And you know, campaigns, political campaigns require hundreds of thousands to participate physically. And that had an impact. So if you look at that, and then you really strictly limit the campaigns to online, radio, video, television, social media, that will have an impact in terms of the reach, how political parties will reach out to their supporters. So those political parties or candidates that have urban-based supporters who have an upper hand, and those that have rural-based supporters who have a disadvantage in terms of reach to their supporters because of differences in terms of internet penetration, differences in terms of access to television, radio, as well as social media communication. So these are some of the things that perhaps campaigning may not really have a level playing field in terms of political parties and candidates. The other issue that I wanted to raise is mostly demographic in terms of electoral participation, both at candidate level and the voter level. You know, this pandemic is affecting those who are aged. So it's also affecting those who have chronic diseases. And once preventive measures are communicated to the general public, that those that are aged should ensure that they keep themselves indoor. Those that have chronic illnesses are vulnerable and they have to be indoor. It will have an impact in terms of those who participate in this process, in terms of candidates as well as voters. So this will have an issue in terms of level playing field. For example, if you have a political party in your own country, like a Tea Party, where most of the supporters are aged 50 and above, then you are at a disadvantage because only young people who participate in that process, because the old ones are afraid of catching the disease and they are locked themselves in their houses. So that has an impact as well. In terms of election integrity, I think there is quite a lot in terms of what you miss under the COVID-19 pandemic. Election observation is one of it. We didn't have international observers other than those residing in Malawi. We didn't have international observers coming into Malawi to observe the electoral process, and that may apply to any other countries that are holding elections under the COVID-19 environment. So electoral integrity is questioned when you don't have such referees in your processes. Yes, you have the local observers, but even their travel may be restricted if the COVID-19 pandemic is in such a way that there are restrictions in terms of travel in country. So these are issues that perhaps I wanted to share with the meeting. So for any elections to be deemed credible, a level playing field must be guaranteed amongst the contesting candidates as well as political parties. And to ensure this level playing field, the electoral processes should allow many mediums of communication, as many as possible, for voters to learn about the candidates' manifestos in a safe manner. And under the COVID-19 environment, that safety is not guaranteed. And you may end up losing out some voters because of that. With regard to voter turnout, yes, that is another important factor in terms of ensuring or demonstrating general public trust as well as interest in the electoral process. And that has kind of been affected in terms of participation by voters in the process, because other voters, as I said, using the demographic factors, you may find that the aged ones may not be as free to participate as voters, as well as those that have chronic illnesses. The same applies in a situation where candidates are pushed to campaign online and or using some electronic means like television and radios there will sure be an imbalance between those with the urban support base and where internet penetration is very high, and those that have rural support base where internet penetration is very low. And again, that may have, those wealthier candidates or political parties may have an edge as well, as they will tend to use significant resources to gain airtime on radio and television programming. And this will therefore create an imbalance in terms of reach that the candidates may enjoy. So most countries, from experience, most countries that are applying COVID-19 preventive measures are limiting the human physical interaction. And with the above challenges that I just mentioned and observations, it is practically impossible to have a level playing field in the context of COVID-19. And the most affected activities being the civic and voter education, or voter information and education, as well as political party and candidates' campaign processes. So limiting public gatherings means traditional ways of civic and voter education and political party campaign should not be applied. And with that kind of restrictions, if indeed strictly followed, the level playing field will not be there. In conclusion, it has been proved to be a very big challenge to strike a balance between the right to life and the right to vote, or the right to participate in the electoral activity. But people tell you the political will is always there to ensure that elections are conducted, because it is believed that most of these political impasses, like what we had in Malawi, the final resolve could be through the means of having a credible election. But the warning is, as much as we know that elections are a solution to political impasses or democratic strengthening, we have to ensure that those elections provide a level playing field, and at the end of it all, they are credible to ensure that they are generally acceptable, and really provides that basis to resolve the political impasse and provide a platform for strengthening the democratic processes. That is what I wanted to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Alufandika. I think you've raised a lot of issues that are very relevant for this discussion, but also for the next presenters. So the question of how participation can be effective when there are virtual means, the issue of demographics and participation, and maybe both participation and inclusion, the question of public trust in the electoral processes as the currency that is needed to make elections meaningful, the complexities of how campaigning can be done effectively by parties for them to be able to get traction with the voters. And I think all these issues that you flagged are going to be useful for all of us to look at. So now what I want to do is to ask Dr. Miria Matembe to give us a sense about Uganda, because of precisely some of the things that you've raised, which I will highlight just for her to keep in mind as she does her presentation. But Dr. Matembe herself, she has had a very long, illustrious career as an academic, as a woman human rights defender, and she has also been a parliamentarian, I think even sitting in the Pan-Africa Parliament representing Uganda, where she was to become the chairperson of the Committee on Rules, Privileges. So her dedicated fight for upgrading the rights of women has also been very, very noticeable. If I may ask our IT people to mute those who are maybe not speaking. But then I think in speaking about Uganda, I've heard Dr. Matembe, that there is a theory of, is it scientific elections? In my discussions with the Secretary General of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, who is Ugandan, Martin Masiga, I have a vague recollection of him speaking about the need, the fact that the country is going to go through what is being referred to as a scientific election, in that there won't be physical processes. So many of the things are going to be done virtually and digitally. So the question that Mr. Alufandika spoke about in terms of the reach, the access, the penetration in terms of internet, television, radio, the issue of our people's sophistication, the question of the demographic. I know that Uganda may be, between Uganda and Niger, one of the two is the youngest population in Africa. I think Uganda is about 16.5, that's the mean age. And so there's also the questions that may be very close to your heart, Doctor, in terms of not just participation, but the question of inclusion, inclusion of women, inclusion of the youth demographic and the girl or woman demographic in the electoral processes. So let's hear from you about the question of participation and inclusion in Uganda in the context of scientific elections. Over to you, Dr. Miria Matembe.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to hope that you'll be hearing me, because I've been having some problem with your network. At times I hear, at times I lose you, but I hope you will hear me through. Well, as you said, Miria Matembe, I've been a politician for quite some time, but of it I haven't been in elective politics. And I want to say that I'm very happy to have been invited to participate in this debate. I want to say that Uganda is really a unique country. It has remained unique all this time. What I mean is, in Uganda here, we have never seen or experienced a peaceful handover of power from one elected president to another. You can imagine we are going to the year 8 years since independence. We are still grappling with these problems. When President Seven came to power in 1986 and made a new constitution, Ugandans were concerned with presidents who don't want to leave power. Therefore, they proposed that in the constitution we put the presidential term limit of 5 years per term. And even on top of that, we said we should also age limit. But as I talk right now, both the age limit and the term limit were voluntarily removed, just giving President Museveni a lifetime presidency. So it is against this kind of unfortunate environment that I'm asked to present to you elections and the rule of law in Uganda. In fact, to be honest, for us in Uganda, although we run a de jure multi-party political system, de facto we are like a militarized one-party state. And so it is in view of that I'm going to present what I'm presenting to you. I want to say that in principle, elections thrive on 3 fundamental liberties. That is freedom of movement, which relates to the right of individuals to travel from place to place within the territory in the constituency to consult and campaign. The second one, of course, is freedom of assembly, which means you meet the right to hold public rallies and public meetings, and you talk to your agents and your voters, and you hold delegate conferences and the like. The third one is freedom of association, which is the individual's right to join or leave a group voluntarily. This relates to the right to form political parties, organizations, formations, alliances, coalitions, pressure groups, and the like. Various constitutional frameworks guarantee these three fundamental freedoms, and they form the basis of the political liberties as contained in Magna Carta. However, in Uganda, actually, it is not COVID. To be honest, in Uganda, to talk of a level field where people are equally get equal opportunities to participate and hold elections, it hasn't been. It is always a struggle. But now, Uganda, which is now less than 5 months from elections, we seem to have exploited COVID-19 circumstances to even do more in compromising fair electoral competitions between the ruling NIM and the opposition. And these are some of the examples. Of course, you have already said that we are talking of scientific elections. We don't even know what scientific elections mean, because they are talking of having told campaigns on mass media, on whatever you call it. So freedom of movement remains limited. About a third of Uganda remains under partial lockdown. Movement in 4 border districts remains limited. And then incumbent politicians and NRM aspiring candidates are allowed to travel in lockdown districts, consult and campaign or mobilize. Aspiring candidates, the new one from the opposition, aren't permitted to travel or either to be in their constituency or other border districts. State security is enforcing COVID-19 guidelines through partisan lenses. Whereas the ruling NRM candidates allowed free movement, the opposition political figures such as the Wambui, the Dr. those who seem to be popular, are prevented from accessing the majority of districts in Uganda. In cases where they have traveled outside Kampala, they have been met with excessive force from state security, get beaten up, tortured, bullets, tear gas. Even within Kampala, opposition aspirants who have indicated interest in running for presidency have been arrested on flimsy grounds, such as moving Thuo from TV radio talks after TV show because they see curfew time. With the planned so-called digital campaigns that will replace media shows, there is high likelihood of seeing more and more arrests on grounds floating curfews. When we got freedom of assembly, it is restricted through partisan lenses in the COVID-19 context. Uganda's Ministry of Health COVID-19 guidelines that are still in force. Any meeting convened by opposition political parties, such as Forum for Democratic Change or Uganda's People Conference, UPCDP, and any other, no matter how small the number of participants has been brutally broken up, and in many cases resulted in some deaths. On the other hand, meetings of hundreds of people convened by members of the ruling national resistance movement go on uninterrupted, and in fact, they are fully secure. You find state security guarding them. State security arrests few, 5-10 people of the opposition parties. When we go freedom of association, Mr. Chairman, this is under serious test. As a response to COVID-19, government passed regulations that restricted political parties for convening the internal electoral processes. While the political parties and organizations, the conduct of meetings and elections regulations 2020 were posted as an attempt to enable political parties to decide on leaders and sponsor candidates for nomination for elections without compromising the health and safety of members or the public. In actual sense, they banned inter-party electoral processes such as delegate conferences and made it difficult for political parties to negotiate alliances and coalitions. Limitation of the so-called scientific elections. Now, the Electoral Commission proposed to go ahead with the elections in 2021, despite the absence of the infrastructure to make elections inclusive and credible in the context of COVID-19. Campaigns, despite the people in Uganda have been demanding for postponement of elections if we cannot hold them in the normal way. But the government has insisted that elections must be held in a scientific manner. What does scientific manner mean? Campaigns will, for instance, be aired on radio, TV, and social media. Uganda's media infrastructure is not fully developed. Radio and TV penetration stand at less than 30% countrywide. Even then, active NRM politicians own more than 90% of the media channels in Uganda. On the other hand, only 13% of the audit population has access to the internet within their household. Limiting campaigns to digital platforms will affect citizen participation in electoral processes. Even those who have access to internet, it remains expensive. Besides, there is a deterrent OTT tax that discourages internet use. So limiting campaigns to scientific, whatever they call it, will leave out many Ugandans who do not access internet, and even those who are not incumbent, who have not been accessing money. This business has been locked down, economy is down, and you say that they must campaign on TV and radios, and those are very expensive. The whole exercise looks really a real sham. Now, lack of trust in the electoral process, system and commission. Recently, the EC released election guidelines that restricted campaigns to media after consulting only one presidential candidate. Imagine, Yoweri Museveni is the one to decide. Less than 2 weeks ago, one of the presidential candidates, Museveni, fired some of the top members of the Electoral Commission. Can you imagine? They sacked like the whole top management of the Electoral Commission. The CE now is seen as an appendage to the ruling political party, where you find that now the ITC has been sacked, has been replaced by ICT man from the State House. You can imagine. So people do not believe in the Electoral Commission. Government snapped much of the needed progressive electoral reform in favor of those that entrench undemocratic tendencies. The removal of the age limit, grandfathering. You can't believe it, but you can imagine a few months to elections, so many constituencies are being created, such as 71 constituencies. Can you imagine? Because they have realized that some of their ministers and the incumbent are not popular, so they create constituencies that can always come back. The electorate is increasingly becoming pathetic towards elections organized by the EC. And we could see 2021 hosting voter turnout figures, especially more so where voter mobilization education has not been conducted partly due to the COVID-19 disruptions. For me, as a Ugandan who looks at Uganda and see Africa in general We are here discussing electoral processes and the challenges that we see. But having been in the politics of Uganda for quite some time, having been a member of an African parliament, I want to categorically, before I conclude my remarks, that for me, I have looked at Africa's problem of governance, and I want to classify them like this, leave alone electoral processes. Africans have narrow-mindedness and inward looking. We have no vision for our nations, but we have personal ambitions for ourselves, causing tribalism and ethnicity rather than idea of nation building. We have greed for wealth, so leadership is perceived as a path to wealth accumulation rather than a service to people. Instead of we build strong men rather than building strong institutions. I thought I'd use this opportunity to tell you, for me, as far as I'm concerned as a senior citizen, African citizen, it is not more of electoral processes that should be concerned about, because electoral processes now in Africa become a formality. As African people, we need to really look at a fundamental mind shift. I think it is high time that Africans get fed up of what we've been involved in. We drop our slave mentality, we acknowledge and recognize who we are, we perceive ourselves as intelligent people capable of managing our nations and resources. And I want to say that it is high time we recognize resources that have in this continent, we look inwards, unite ourselves, and see how we can live ourselves from all these colonial mentality, all these electoral processes which come with formality. It's not about change of current leadership to have another leadership, but we need a change of mind, a shift mind among the African leaders and led to really begin afresh. I want to conclude by saying that although we are talking about elections, my view is that it's high time Africans get tired and become angry and restless enough to throw our yoke on our necks and raise up and move forward. Thank you for your kind attention.
No, thank you very, very much, Dr. Miria Matembe, and for those very incisive contributions about the question of participation in Uganda and the types of obstacles that society faces around dealing with a country that is not seen, effective multi-party contestation from an outcome perspective in terms of producing results that could result in a peaceful transfer of power between contesting parties. It always looks like, as you put it, that the results look fairly predetermined and set. And it's also a bit of an attack on the confidence in which the public can have about the role of elections in choosing of leadership, where the sense is created that any contestation cannot result in a change, but that the results are fairly predictable. Yet it takes me to Kenya, Lucianna Wambui Thuo, who did her master's at the University of Pretoria, the famous Human Rights and Democratization masters. That, there's a huge group of alumni that have come from that university that are really working across the whole of Africa in institutions of the African Union, as well as academic institutions like yourself, to try and use your knowledge to improve the Africa's human rights and rule of law compliance. Then listening to Dr. Matembe, I couldn't help but ask myself a few questions about Kenya to say that will the
Stuff is on if you're already almost finalizing on it. So it's not next week.
our IT,
Ask when it takes you.
our IT, could you mute those who are not speaking? Perfect, thank you. So, Lucianna, I was saying some of the questions that were lingering in my mind as Dr. Mateba was whether elections are going to be held on time in Kenya or not, given the COVID situation. The other question was on whether they will be peaceful, because for some reason, I followed elections in Zimbabwe and Kenya, and there's that similarity always of what Kenya does almost being replicated in Zimbabwe. And you remember that the confidence of people in elections, but also in international election observation, was given a bit of a knock in 2017 when the impression created in Kenya, just like in Malawi, was that international observers seemed to have said the elections were free and fair. And then the courts in both countries then came to the conclusion that in fact there were serious issues with legality and irregularities that warranted that the elections be run afresh. So Kenya gave us the first nullification, especially at the level of the presidents. And then, so when Dr. Matembe and Mr. Alufandika were speaking about the importance of confidence of the electorate on the question of participation, you can't be effectively participating unless you have confidence in the institutions that are going to run the elections. And then also that when the elections were ordered to be rerun, President Uhuru said we have a problem with the judiciary in our country, which needs to be fixed. And in fact, he then went on, I think, to fix, or in the eyes of a number of people, he tried to fix the judiciary, which is a key institution in giving confidence that if elections are not held properly, at least there can be a dispute resolution system that ultimately goes to the courts that can then inspire confidence that is worthwhile for us to participate. So I know that Chief Justice Maraga is leaving, and that we're going to be having elections anytime soon, and that there's been significant tension between the judiciary and the executive. So given all this, what can we say about electoral participation in Kenya?
Okay, thank you, Arnold. It's a pleasure to take part in this discussion, and I am really grateful to the panelists who've gone ahead of me, because they've raised several issues of concern which are applicable in Kenya, and I will be coming to those at the tail end of my presentation. But let me start by addressing the issues you've raised, Arnold, just so we set the context for the discussion, because I think Kenya's situation is slightly unique. For one, we don't have an official opposition in Kenya. Since 2018, the official opposition was co-opted into the government through the now infamous handshake. And so we've had some of the functions which ordinarily would be performed by the deputy president now being performed by the former leader of the opposition. And because going into the 2017 election, our opposition had formed a coalition, I think questions also then began to arise as to what does that mean for the remaining members of the coalition? Is the coalition dead? Does it continue to serve as the official opposition? Do they seek a fresh mandate? And going into 2022, it has become even more confusing, because those people who had previously formed the opposition in the run-up to the 2017 elections are now individually negotiating some sort of agreement with the incumbents to see how they will be supported to vie in 2022. So even though our elections are scheduled for 2022, we are going into the context with, number one, we don't know who is the opposition and who is not. What was previously the opposition is now partly in government, partly not in government. But we also have a unique situation where we have been in campaign since 2017. I don't know whether any other country has a context like that. But as soon as the elections ended in October of 2017, we started campaigns for 2022. And whereas many countries are concerned about the COVID situation and what that means in terms of freedom of association and the like, the average Kenyan will tell you the COVID situation was a reprieve for us because we were so exhausted by election campaigns which had begun 3-4 years before the election. So just as a starting point, that context is important to point out. The other thing which is important to point out for those who may not be familiar with the Kenyan context is the fact that there is sort of split between the current president and his deputy. The current president's term is expiring in 2022. Constitutionally, he cannot run for a new term. His deputy has indicated that he would like to be the presidential candidate for the party in 2022. They came into power together using a coalition. And there are concerns that he may not receive the support of the incumbent going into the 2022 elections. And what that has meant for him is for him to try and consolidate his own support base outside of the incumbent. So in practical terms, what that has meant is our government is split. There are people who support the incumbent, there are people who support the deputy president, and particularly because they are their feelings that he is a strong contender for the 2022 elections. So what that has done for our context is mean that government operations have been paralyzed. A lot of the government projects have been crippled. Not much is happening because now we are all waiting to see what will that mean for 2022. So will we have elections on time? In terms of the timeline for the elections, it's a constitutional issue. It's fixed by the law. Article 101 of our constitution is very clear. It must happen in August, second Tuesday of August in the 5th year. There is no indication that that can be amended by the courts. So as it stands, it looks like we are going into the elections in 2022. But even for 2020, the pandemic found 5 by-elections having been scheduled and which have now been postponed because of concerns about risk mitigation measures around the pandemic. And so we've had some elections being postponed in Kenya because of that. Your second question around whether it's possible to have peaceful elections. The first point that I made concerning the context is very important for answering that second question. Because of the open campaigning by the deputy president and his supporters, some members of government support him, some members of parliament support him, and then there are others who support the incumbent. What we've seen with the COVID situation, and this has become much clearer with the pandemic, is these restriction measures that have been imposed around limitations on social gatherings, limitations around public meetings are being enforced only against the group that support the president, and they're not being enforced against the group they're being enforced against the group that support the deputy president, but not against people who support the incumbent president. So you'll see funerals, public meetings, party meetings that are held by people considered to be supportive of the deputy president being scaffolded by the security forces, but you don't see similar action being taken where there are violations by persons who support the president. So from the very beginning, you can already see that the playing field is not equal. There is a level of asymmetry around how we are conducting campaigns going into 2022. We also have a crisis with our election management body. Some of you may have followed the news in 2017. In the run-up to the 2017 elections, the person who manages the ICT element of the elections in Kenya, the ICT manager was killed. This is about maybe a week or 10 days before the elections. And so there were already questions around the integrity of our electoral system. As some of you may know, Kenyan elections are partly electronically run. Presidential elections are required to be, presidential election results are required to be transmitted electronically from each polling station to the National Tallying Center. And so the integrity of the election transmission system is very crucial to the integrity of that election. In the run-up to the nullification of the election by the Supreme Court, the deputy chair of the Electoral Commission left the country, saying that she is not confident that Kenya is able to hold free and fair repeat elections, given what she had witnessed firsthand as the vice chair of the commission. And she has also come out vocally to talk about how the death of the ICT manager in 2017 was linked to partisan interests within the body itself. Following her resignation, other commissioners of the electoral management body also resigned, with the effect that I think 3 additional commissioners resigned, with the effect that now we have only 2 commissioners and the chair remaining. And that then means that before we go into 2022, they must be replaced, and we must also complete our boundaries delimitation process. The process of selecting new commissioners, as some of you may know, can be very political. And so whether or not we can get that done in advance of the 2022 elections remains contested. There are concerns about how we choose the people who will be members of that commission. Previously, it has been hotly contested. I don't see that changing in the run-up to the 2022 elections. So at the moment, we are operating in a situation where there's very little confidence in our electoral management body because of those concerns. But even beyond that, our primary adjudicator when it comes to electoral disputes, presidential election disputes, is the Supreme Court. As Arnold has rightly pointed out, our Chief Justice's tenure is ending. Unlikely he will be there in the next presidential election, should that still happen in 2022. Of course, questions around his replacement. But in the recent past, and I think a lot of this came to the fore after the 2017 elections, the Supreme Court has been considered to be partisan. And some of the decisions that they have made around elections, despite the celebrated decision where they nullified the August 2017 election, there have been other elections that they have dealt with, particularly where they have dealt with cases going on appeal to the Supreme Court from the lower courts, where it has been considered that the decision making was not impartial, could not be supported by the law. The exercise of jurisdiction by the Supreme Court, even on those election appeals, is questionable because our Constitution does not create a clear mandate for the Supreme Court to handle appeals arising from other elections going all the way to the Supreme Court. So compounding that situation is also the tension between the judiciary and the executive. Repeatedly, the executive has been accused of stifling the judiciary's work by depriving them of funds which are necessary for them to do their work. At the moment, the Court of Appeal has been crippled. They don't have sittings around the country because they simply don't have the money. We are trying to shift to virtual court sessions, but even for those to happen, we need money for the infrastructure. Government repeatedly saying they don't have the money. And so we are not even assured that normal court operations will continue. Forget about the electoral dispute resolution process. So that's the wider context in which we are operating in terms of the electoral management body, the political structure, and the judiciary. But quickly just going into the discussion today around the other pre-election issues, I think some of the concerns that we have around the by-elections that are required to be held this year, and even the preparation for next year, and particularly where now we have to shift to doing campaigns virtually, doing nomination processes virtually, are around questions of consultation. So the IEBC says we have postponed elections and we are going to now conduct all sessions virtually. But political parties don't have the funds to carry out training of their own candidates or agents. They don't have the funds to shift to virtual campaigning. And the context in which this is being done is also important, because I don't know whether this is the same for other contexts, but in Kenya, the ownership of private media is also closely linked to the political or the ruling class, so that the people who have an upper hand in the shift to a virtual campaigning are the traditional political parties, but which are also the political parties that have been in rulership since independence in terms of the membership, not the name of the political parties. So there are questions then that arise around how do we deal with fair election campaigning where the incumbent and people linked to him already have an unfair advantage in terms of the media? How do we deal with skewed reporting? Some of the reports from the 2017 elections indicated that the state media was directed in some instances to skew reporting away from opposition parties and to deny them access to the media when they wanted to use the media for campaigning, despite very clear provision in the law allowing for equitable access. So how do we shift the balance in instances where the incumbent also has a stake in the media? These are questions that need to be addressed. As I've already mentioned, we already have existing restrictions on association. Party meetings that are being held by people who don't support the incumbent are likely to be scuttled. What does that mean as we go into 2022? The other process which is critical is the voter registration process. If people are not allowed to gather for activities such as voter registration, what does it mean for people who are in the diaspora and who would need to be facilitated to vote, particularly for the presidential election in 2022? There are already restrictions around movement in many countries, but even traditionally, the IEBC has been very reluctant to facilitate diaspora voters to register. So this could also be another excuse to continue excluding diaspora voters, who are a significant number, from being registered to vote in the coming elections. And it's something we need to think about. Where there are indications that the voter registration process will be truncated, how will we be able to audit the voter registration process through the inspection of the register? Will there be opportunities for the registers to be put up online for us to be able to review them? Finally, and this is, I think, crucial for groups that ordinarily are excluded from the process, how do we, in light of the new context, assure the participation of marginalized groups? Funding is limited, as you're all aware, because a lot of the funding has shifted to public health measures, both locally and globally. Participation of marginalized groups has largely been assisted by donor funding in Kenya. So now that that shift has happened, how do we continue to support marginalized groups, whether it's women, persons with disabilities, or youth, to participate? Our statistics indicate that political parties are very unwilling to front women and young people and persons with disabilities as candidates. Now, with the restrictions of COVID, if you are limited as to what you can do in terms of promoting your candidate, you want a candidate with the widest possible appeal to people, and those are unlikely to be people from marginalized groups or marginalized communities. So there needs to be concern around how do we keep securing the participation of marginalized groups, particularly where we have depended on donor funding to facilitate those processes and which funding has largely gone down. In terms of the larger measures, how do we ensure that the state gets the support of the people? And I'm talking here about the fact that Kenya has, like many African countries, taken very strong public security measures to restrict movement, to restrict association. How does the government build trust going forward? How do we ensure that any changes which come up don't appear to be skewing the playing field in favor of the incumbent as opposed to the opposition? I would recommend, and learning from the 2017 experience in Kenya, if we're going to make any changes in the law, they need to be done well in advance of the elections, at least a year before. There needs to be wide consultation. There needs to be sufficient planning. There needs to be sufficient stakeholder engagement to ensure that the government does not continue to lose the trust of the people. But of course, the responsibility remains ours as citizens. We must remain vigilant, and that is the price that we will have to continue paying for liberty. Allow me to stop there because of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucianna, for that erudite presentation around the context on Kenya, as well as the very specifics that you feel factors that affect the ability of effective participation, but also the creation of a fair electoral playing field to allow for Kenya to have meaningful elections. And of course, I think your concern about Kenya being almost in a semi-permanent electoral mode and how that affects nation building. I think that is a very important point to make. So colleagues, participants who are here, this is a webinar which is being done by the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum in collaboration with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and supported by the USAID. So this is the second of a series of webinars. I think the total that are lined up are 5. And today the focus is on how to make the electoral playing field even in order to allow for people to have enough confidence that elections have a meaning. So we are proceeding. Can you hear me, Mamo? I can see that I might be frozen. Are people hearing me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm hearing.
Okay, good. So what we are now going to do is to proceed to my friend Leah Mitaba from Zambia. She is the person who works very closely with the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network in trying to coordinate civil society in Zambia to protect human rights, to protect civic space, but also to give meaning to the people of Zambia in terms of the importance of participating in elections. So Leah, you've heard colleagues from Uganda speaking about scientific elections, the question of the obstacles to people's participation, the issue of maybe limited opportunities for participation and inclusion with the demographic question. You have also heard in Malawi that it looks impossible until it happens. So many of the obstacles that the Malawi Commission went through around the time, the determination on the part of the previous authorities to retain power, the COVID-19 lockdown measures, and the fact that the seeming contestation between the public health needs, which is essentially the right to life, versus the question of democratic growth and accountable governance. Because without accountable governance, even the fight against COVID can be undermined. We have seen in Southern Africa reports of corruption and misuse of the COVID budgets, but also the milking of the COVID lockdown measures in order to maintain power and undermine the ability of people to participate. Then the question of institutions. So Zambia is almost pretty much in the same situation as many of the presenters. So let's hear from you, Leah. You're muted.
So maybe in beginning, I'll give the fundamental understanding of what would be defined as a credible election, which in this case must reflect the free expression of the will of the people. And to achieve these elections should be transparent, inclusive, and accountable. And there must be equitable opportunities to compete in the elections. So going by this definition, you can see that we live in the reality of uncredible elections in Africa and Zambia as well. From the Zambian perspective, this also holds true. This gets more visible even now as we go to towards an election year such as 2021, when we see the narrative is characterized with distribution of political materials as well as financial favors to the electorates and even party officials just to get adopted. So for instance, the primary elections have started within the parties themselves. And it's only those people that have money that finally get adopted. So already you can see that the field is largely unleveled. And then the COVID-19 pandemic has also worsened the situation. For instance, we see that certain parties, and in this case, like for the Zambian experience, the ruling party really they are able to hold meetings, some of which, they're braving the COVID pandemic and they're not even wearing masks. Other times they're wearing masks, but then they're not keeping the social distancing. And you find that within that crowd, a few people don't even have masks. And we are living at a time where quite a number of our ministers and our members of parliament are actually at the moment recovering from the COVID pandemic. Others have recovered. Situation that, and then we've also lost to see that there's actually worry. And then because also they get to use resources, you find that the cadres and the electorates want to go and receive those little monies. So they still go and convene. So we see a situation that is really like skewed. On the part of the opposition parties, we find that are put in force. So you find that they're not allowed to meet or have the meetings that they're supposed to have. So you said that already there's that unequal playing field. The other thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore is the gap that is coming from the digital divide. So you find that, I think a colleague earlier on did mention, I think from Malawi, that more than 80% of the population is in rural areas. It's the same for Zambia as well. So we have more than 80% of the people in rural areas. Cousins, my relatives from Katete, they don't have access to sanitizers. They are challenged even to just observe the COVID pandemic responses that have been put in place. And then also the other thing is when you look at maybe, for instance, the use of virtual platforms, maybe they would rather buy a small phone because the battery sometimes maybe every 2 to 3 hours. So couple that with the aspect of widespread load shedding, as well as inability of certain rural areas to have access to power, you find that they're unable to join these facilities. Next month, we should be starting the voter registration process and verification. And right now, the Electoral Commission of Zambia has been taken to court by Chapter 1 Foundation because the restriction of 30 days, stakeholders are wondering how that is going to be possible. So that already is an issue that is on the ground. The other aspect is to do with equality of participation. The campaign is marked by name calling, which edges out women, youths, and other minority groups, such as people with disabilities. If we had to do maybe a simple assessment and just to assess how many people with disabilities are in this parliament of ours in Africa and Zambia, you find that some of them actually have none. So how do you have a level playing field in that reality? The other thing that we look at and our concern at the moment is that the election observers, I think, tend to gloss over some of these unfair practices that are happening on the ground. And I must mention that Zambia, alongside other 171 countries under the United Nations, are state party to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, for instance, which I think is a key treaty that compels member states to actually ensure that they preserve basic human rights, such as the right to life and human dignity, equality before the law, freedom of speech, assembly and association, religious freedom, and privacy, freedom from torture, ill treatment, and arbitrary detention, gender equality, the right to a fair trial, and minority rights. And I think within that, you see that there's a lot to do with civic space, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to actually meet and, convene and talk about maybe the candidate that we want to see, for instance. But this is not happening. And of course, the COVID-19 situation, restrictions are actually making this worse. So to help me with this presentation, I also just did a simple a snapshot to get views from a cross-section of Zambians. And I'll go through to read these perspectives because I think they summarize really what is so clearly an equal playing field. So the first perspective, which is from a lady, says there's considerable corruption in many parties' candidate selection, which discriminated against poorer candidates and women and the youth being in majority. Women are disadvantaged because the media would rather discuss their clothes and relationships and marital status than their policy platform. And the freedom of speech, freedom of association are ruling party only. The permit from the police will be granted even though they have no right to refuse, no power to grant. A second perspective came from a young person who says unfair application of the Public Order Act in Zambia. We have one of these notorious acts, Arnold and colleagues here in Zambia, which is known as a Public Order Act, which the government can choose to enforce any minute. So this perspective is saying most of the times opposition political parties are denied permission by the police to conduct campaigns, yet the ruling party goes about conducting their businesses, selling their campaign messages without the act being enforced. The second one is the ruling party takes advantage of their power and use government resources, putting them at a higher advantage than their counterparts in the opposition. Whichever government is in power uses government resources for party business with impunity, including campaigning while on government business. The third perspective had to do with political violence, which inhibits others, especially women, from participating in the elections. Corruption, where political parties buy votes from the electorate, and unfair media coverage. Other political opponents, especially those in the opposition, the main news on national radio, national television station is completely one-sided. The national radio and national TV stations, as the name suggests, are for the whole nation. And as such, I would desire a situation where all political stakeholders, both in power and otherwise, are awarded equal access to these facilities. Unfortunately, this is not the situation. So given those perspectives, you'll see that African states are still a long way from achieving many of the provisions within their own national constitutions, but also in the regional as well as international legal instruments, such as the ICCPR, for instance, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So the question that remains now is that, what do we do? And I think the good news is that you and I have an opportunity before, during, as well as post-election period to ensure more equitable participation of all eligible candidates. And I think we do not need cosmetic additional seats. For instance, in the case of Zambia, we had a notorious Bill 10 that is trying to be sneaked into Parliament, which they are saying through Bill 10, for instance, we're going to close the gaps, the gender gap, the youth gap, as well as, you know, looking at people with disabilities. So what they are proposing to do is to add 40 seats to the current, which is about 150 something, 160. So we are saying, how do you then achieve gender equality by adding 40 seats, which are going to be shared? Maybe 10 will go to the youth, 10 will go to the people with disabilities, maybe another 10 to the women. It means that in the current parliament, for instance, which has 17 members of parliament, we're going to raise the number to 27. Is that the way in which we deal with the structural issues related to leveling the playing field insofar as elections are concerned? And we think this is not the answer. And the question that I would like now to also pose even to this group as well is that who really, if we have progressive constitutions that speak to we the people of Zambia without discrimination and all that, then also if we have our countries that have ascribed to the SADC, to the AU and to the United Nations treaties, which are progressive. And we see that, for instance, Zambia has domesticated the AU 50-50 gender protocol. But this is over like maybe a decade, and yet we're still struggling to achieve it. Who should we hold accountable? Is it just the nations that are not, that are failing to close the gaps? Or even these same host institutions, such as the SADC, such as the AU, even the UN as well must be held accountable, because I think a lot of resources go in these institutions, even just to maintain their running. But I think when you get to domestication of some of these regulations, in as much as we are quick to do that as states, I think the implementation thereof doesn't happen. I mean, Zambia has just presented a summary voluntary national review under the SDGs to look at the progress that we have achieved to so far, insofar as the SDGs are concerned. And they didn't have the report at all, yet it was voluntary. What they presented was just a summary through a video, and of course, that was protected under the COVID-19 jacket. But we're saying, how can we then have that mutual accountability and ensure that we make progress in these areas? So I think in a nutshell, really, I'll put it to this group to say that I think we are far from achieving an equal playing field, and the COVID-19 pandemic is actually working to worsen the situation. I think that's it from me.
Thanks. I knew we could count on you for a brilliant presentation about the situation in Zambia. Thank you very much. And I liked your approach of the election cycle approach, so that you look at elections before, during, and after, rather than just elections during the time of the carrying out of elections, which I think is one of the biggest weaknesses, especially that international observers have received in situations where during the elections there appears to be normalcy, and elections are then declared free and fair. And then when they get challenged, the courts are then able to reflect on the entire full electoral cycle and come to a conclusion that may then undermine the role of international observers. So I think that approach of a full electoral cycle approach in looking at the performance of elections in our countries, I think it's something that we need to increasingly move towards. And Zambia, it's also a bit disappointing generally because of the fact that it was one of the frontline states that provided for the liberation of countries south of the Zambezi, and you people, the Zambian people, took a lot in terms of personal sacrifices to try and engender liberation, including the question of one person, one vote as an anchor on which Southern African democracies were built. So I think from that good example to a situation which you now explain, where the COVID measures are used to create arbitrary opportunities for arbitrary arrest, detention, and in any case prevention of allowing for the playing field to be fair, is something that is said. But I think with people like yourselves and other human rights defenders, we know that you will not allow for a situation where elections lose their meaning. So I'm very grateful that we have Mfundo Mlilo.
Mr. Arnold, do we still have you?
Lilo here from Zimbabwe. I'll explain a little bit about Mfundo and what he's going to do. But something happened. Did you lose? I'm back. Mamu, is it okay?
Yes, yeah, we seem to have lost you for a second, but I think all systems are go now, yeah.
Okay, so as I said, Brian Penduka and Victoria Scott, representing the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum and IFES respectively, are tracking questions that need to be answered and will help us to direct them to the appropriate panelists. But at the same time, I've also seen already that on the chat box, we are having a very healthy debate around issues that have already been presented. So I would encourage you to continue on that path. And without wasting too much time, let me ask my brother Mfundo Mlilo, who is a civil society leader from Zimbabwe and who agreed to step in on very short notice to make his views about the question of what is needed to be done in Zimbabwe in order to try and create a fair electoral field, but also the question of restoring confidence in the public and civics in Zimbabwe, that civic participation is actually useful for Zimbabweans to be able to see that elections can actually produce leaders that reflect the free will of the people as expressed in an election. But at the same time, that ultimately the quest for better governance, I think Zimbabweans always say that we are not asking to govern, but we are asking to be governed better. And I think that is an extremely important issue to allay the fears of politicians to be held accountable in the way in which they run public office. So Mfundo, as you were about to speak, listening to Lucianna, our sister from Kenya, you know, there are a few things she said which may help for you to also just clarify a bit. The first one, she said, who is the opposition in Kenya? The second one, she says, we have been in an electoral mode and not nation building mode since 2017. The third, she said, is there free political participation? She answered that question. Then she then said, we have a problem with the election management body. Then there's also been a number of killings and human rights violations. And she says that there's also the question of impunity for political killings. Then she spoke about concerns around the electoral boundaries and little confidence that the election management body can carry out an effective election boundaries process. And then there's also limited confidence with the court system and some questions around the jurisdiction of the court. And then there's also the question of the executive stifles the judiciary in Kenya. So, and then there's also the question of laws that affect public order, you know, participation in the public space. So those are the questions about Kenya. So as you are speaking, I was wondering why is she presenting on your behalf? Mfundo, over to you.
No, thanks. Thanks a lot. I think that when you, when you listen to Kenya and listen to, I think even Zambia, the speakers that have spoken before, you can almost think that they are speaking about Zimbabwe, I think, as you have, rightly noted. I think in Zimbabwe, we have a crisis of governance. I think dating back to 2018, elections, because there have been hanging questions immediately after the election, which have not been addressed. I think many people on the panel, will notice that Zimbabwe had some kind of a transition coup in 2017, which has exacerbated the situation in Zimbabwe. So from 2017 up to date, the situation in Zimbabwe has deteriorated to an extent.
Yeah, IT, do you mind muting those that are not speaking? Yes, go ahead, Mfundo.
Yeah, so I was saying that the situation in Zimbabwe has deteriorated, I think, from the, I would say from the 2017 military transition that we saw in Zimbabwe to a situation now in which I think that there is now need for an external solution in Zimbabwe. External in that the continued crisis of governance and militarization of state institutions has gone to a level where I think that the SADC and the African Union now need to step in and assist the Zimbabweans to resolve these questions, because we cannot be talking about preparedness for elections amid the kind of attack on the constitution, the kind of attack on human rights and the attacks on democracy that we have seen. I think in the last 1 month, we've virtually seen what I would call an outlaw of the opposition, wherein they are unable to communicate with their members, they are unable to exercise their rights, where journalists are being arrested. I think Hopewell Chinono is currently in prison for virtually, exposing the corruption that we have seen in public institutions. So he's languishing in jail right now. He has been denied bail. So the exercise of human rights has basically been outlawed in Zimbabwe, and it's difficult to then speak around preparedness for elections, because we have this broader governance questions, which I think now need an external solution. But before I go there are many issues. I think if you read local and international observer groups that have come to Zimbabwe, particularly after the 2018 elections or even the 2013 elections, there are many issues which they flagged out, which continue to be outstanding questions for elections, even as far as elections we have held since time immemorial. If you look at the 2002 elections, the 2008 elections, the 2013 elections, the 2018 elections, all these questions remain outstanding. And one of the key issues is around the independency of the commission. There are serious questions around the ability of the commission in Zimbabwe, the election management board in Zimbabwe, to be able to deliver a free and fair election. So if people do not have confidence in terms of the ability of the electoral body to manage elections, then that impacts heavily on trust that people have on institutions that are charged with delivering elections. And then second, there's the question of even if you look at within that, the secretariat of the election management body is basically militarized. You have serving state security, you have serving military people who are serving within the election management body, and these pander to the interests of the ruling party. You have the question of the media, where if you read past reports, there have been questions also around the state virtually reporting a one-sided view. The opposition has been blacked out of the public media, so they rely on private media. But as we have heard also from Zambia, and I think also Kenya, the state has taken interest in private media. They are acquiring stakes in the private media. So part of what we've been calling private media for a long time has also now been, what I would say, privatized to the interests of the state. So Zimbabwe faces many challenges in terms of preparations for elections. So the main challenge that I see is that of informal and informal institutions. So yes, the laws are problematic, and I think that there's discussions in Parliament right now around how do we prepare laws, or how do we reform laws so that in 2023, when we expect to have elections, Zimbabwe might be ready for elections. But I don't think that the challenge has been lost, because I think for the past 20 years, Zimbabwe has been talking about how do we reform laws, and there has been some reform in terms of laws. And in 2013, we had a new constitution, which in many respects allows the country to be able to have what you call stronger institutions supporting democracy. But the problem has been behavior. Our state is unable to respect its own laws. So if the state is unable to respect its own laws, no matter what good laws you may have, if the government of the day of the state is not willing to respect those laws, then it's problematic. And then now you have a government in which, in the cabinet, there are almost 4 former army generals. So the situation in Zimbabwe has become so complicated in that, in my view, the whole question of discussions around elections, have become even more difficult. That now what we need to do is to have a larger conversation with the Southern African countries, with SADC and the African Union around an intervention in Zimbabwe. I don't know how this intervention could be. But as we have seen also in the last 1 week, the president of South Africa, who is also the chair of the African Union, is sending emissaries to Zimbabwe to try and understand this outblow of the crisis of human rights. So I think that this is where our focus should be, because preparations for elections will be difficult within the context in which we are seeing massive violations of human rights. And COVID has kind of complicated the situation because the state has taken advantage of this situation and virtually introduced a curfew. So which means between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., there's no movement. But this is unscientific. This is not related to any COVID measures because you cannot see how these measures are related to improving the situation of COVID. It is meant to clamp down on human rights. It is a cover which the state has used to abduct people. We've seen abductions in Harare. We've seen abductions in Malawi, and these abductions are continuing. So major opposition leaders right now are in hiding as a result of the clampdown by the state. So we are in a very difficult situation as Zimbabwe. It is different from 2019 or from 2018 when we're moving towards elections, where we're talking about how to improve the environment so that we have got free and fair elections. But we're in a situation now where the government has militarized, where the government has virtually become the law unto itself, and has outlawed the opposition, has unleashed a massive attack on democracy activists, on journalists. So we are at I would say, at a different level than what we are seeing in Kenya, than what we are seeing in Zambia. We're in a situation where our African brothers within these countries and the African Union need to take an active and direct interest in Zimbabwe and help us unlock this logjam, because on our own, I do not think that Zimbabweans are able to sit down and talk about the independence of the commission, talk about the media. These are smaller issues compared to the attacks that we are seeing on persons. So the right to life has been seriously threatened. The rights, many rights have virtually been suspended in Zimbabwe. So we have a difficult and very complicated situation in Zimbabwe, which I think that must be the subject of discussion. How do we, as we saw in 2008, come up with a SADC and African Union facilitated political settlement in Zimbabwe that allows people to be able to come back again and discuss how to prepare free and fair elections. I think this will be my contribution.
Thank you. Thank you, Mfundo. And it's a very sad picture that you've painted, but certainly it's not a beauty contest. So I think it's useful that colleagues from the African countries who are interested in democracy can hear from a civil society leader what you think is the situation that is pre-election environment and what needs to be done to give confidence to Zimbabweans to feel that elections are a useful enterprise. So quite difficult. And then colleagues, I still see that the participation has not changed. And those who have got questions, Victoria and Brian, are flagging those questions to me, but I've also seen there's a debate that is happening on the chats. The one question that I'm going to read out so that panelists, you can think about it to see what to do about it, is coming from one Hepimo Shidziva. With these governments abusing the COVID regulations to stay in power, aren't we going to have a problem on electoral day as they declare a bigger number and COVID-19 patients to refuse them the right to vote? So there is certainly the danger of COVID being milked to prevent effective participation. But I wanted to now, since the questions are not there on the platform, but basically to probe further, because I think we still have about 20 minutes. Brian, correct? Yes. So Sam Alufandika, I'm sorry to put you, thanks Victoria. Sam, I'll put you on the spot because what you have listened from colleagues is the problem statement to say for us to have an electoral environment that makes elections meaningful, that makes it possible for people to feel confident that elections are a necessary enterprise, that make people believe that the leaders that are going to emerge out of elections are actually a true reflection of the free expression of the will of the people themselves, that then makes people feel that they have urgency for accountable governance. in the sense that if the people who are elected do not deliver according to promises and expectations of the people, then they will be able to use the next election to deliver a judgment about their performance, including deciding to rearrange who is in power. And that is the purpose for elections. And that's what the pre-independence liberation fighters fought for in Africa, because the colonial process deprived Africans of their right to participate in elections and in the civic and economic affairs of their own countries. So when you look at history, the Patrice Lumumbas, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Robert Mugabes, the Julius Nyereres, the Samora Machels, the main reason why they participated in the liberation of Africa, one thing that was always putting forward was the right to one person, one vote, so that Africans can have a free ability to decide their own destiny. But that's not happening. And you've heard from election practitioners that the electoral environment is so difficult. So you have experienced it yourself, that within a short space of time, you were required to deliver on an election and to create an environment that would allow for the election to have a meaning, and you achieved it. So having had all these problems, can you please give us a solution? What do we do in these countries?
Thank you very much. It's really a mouthful question, but I'll try to explain as much as possible in terms of steps to ensure that a credible election is delivered. I think the best way of ensuring that you achieve the credible election under COVID-19 pandemic and within the context that the most African countries' elections are being managed, I think it's to ensure that you do a lot of consultations to achieve buy-in, and then you have to just follow the electoral law. Most of our laws, electoral laws in these countries, are enabling laws in terms of achieving credible elections. But I think from our experience in Malawi, what we like as electoral management bodies, and indeed stakeholders in the electoral process, because it's not just electoral commissions, but the rest of the stakeholders, is to follow the law. If there is that will for all stakeholders in the electoral process to follow the law to the letter, and then to join hands in achieving a credible election, it happens. But I think the tendency is to leave everything to the electoral management body to achieve that. As an electoral practitioner and professional, that is a non-starter. I think for us as electoral management bodies and for us as countries to achieve credible elections, it requires close coordination and efforts of all stakeholders in the electoral process, political parties inclusive, civil society organizations, the government. I had issues of funding becoming a problem. If the government is committed to fund the electoral process fully, then that falls off. Political parties have to show commitment. Both the ruling party, opposition parties have to show commitment in terms of ensuring adherence to the electoral laws, to ensure that they play according to the rules of the game. That is very important, because if they don't, no matter what efforts the electoral management bodies exert or press on the electoral process, it will not achieve anything. Yes, there is a lot of manipulation from the political angle in terms of the electoral process. That has to be put in check. Otherwise, the efforts of the electoral management bodies are going to kind of meaningless achievement if the political parties do not work together with the electoral management bodies to ensure that the elections are free and fair. So too with the civil society organizations. We have a good example in Malawi during the implementation of the 2020 fresh presidential election, where most civil society organizations joined hands to provide a strong observation mechanism. And that added some credibility to the electoral process. And because everybody knew the civil society organizations have put the electoral process in check, and that helped quite a lot in terms of how political parties conducted themselves, how the electoral management body conducted itself in terms of the implementation of the process. And coupled with that was a strong security measure taken by the Malawi Police Service as well as the Malawi Defense Force. For the first time, I'm pleased to say that there was security at all levels, at both polling station level, district level, and the national tally center level throughout the implementation of the electoral process. And that instilled quite a lot of trust in the voters that their vote will count and there will be one person, one vote in that electoral process. And indeed, I think what people want to see on the ground is to ensure that their vote at the end of the election process will count. That's one. Two, they want to ensure that there is no illegitimate votes coming in the process. That is very important, and that is exactly what happened in Malawi. And I believe with that, it is bringing hope to the rest of the countries to say, yes, we can achieve a credible electoral process. If we join hands, it's not the work of an EMB only, it's everybody else. Every player has to play their rightful roles if we are to achieve a credible process. Otherwise, we'll be conducting elections that are meaningless, that are not bringing any consolidation of democracy, because there will be a source of a political impasse if we are not careful as countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So on process, what I'm going to do is to ask one person who had raised a hand to ask a question, and then thereafter, we're going to give the panelists a minute each, just to say, I know it sounds a bit unfair, but time is run out. So I'll give you a minute or two to say your final remarks after the question has been asked. The Secretary General of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, who is our host, is something to say. So I'll give Mr. Martin Masiga, our SG, an opportunity to speak, maybe for the briefest possible time. Mr. SGC.
Yeah, thank you, Arnold. I wanted to ask a question to all our presenters. We had yesterday or the day before, and Brian Penduka will bear me witness. We heard from our West African colleagues from the Electoral Commission bodies there. They said, I think from Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and Burundi, they said that there has been a spike of infections which has been directly associated with the electoral process in those countries, the campaigns in those countries, because there was that physical interaction that COVID is frustrating. And thinking of the actual effect that COVID poses to life, and the reality that even when you have a campaign process in the traditional way, you still will not have a genuine result where, except of course in Malawi and a few countries like that in Africa, you still won't have the purpose of the election achieved. Why do we insist on having elections where we are going to lose both people and lose the very purpose for the election as well? So we won't have the deepening of democracy, and yet we lose life. Why do we not consider that perhaps it might be better to save life by postponing these elections? I would like to request that all of the participants, presenters respond.
The problem with your request, Mr. Secretary General, is that we are left with 3 minutes. So I think practically it's not possible to get a response unless there's someone who has a short, sharp answer. I'm really moving towards inclining.
I have a short answer.
Yes, Dr. Miria Matembe.
The short answer is that in Uganda, we've been thinking like that, and we tried our best to prevent elections taking place. But because of self-centeredness of our leaders who love power like mad, they would rather have the people die and yet gain nothing. Because for sure, like in Uganda, these elections, as you have listened to me, are not resulting anything. And yet if people are to die, they will die and the elections will be meaningless. That's why I was saying in my conclusion that the people of Africa need to know and learn that all these formalities do not take us anywhere.
Thank you, Doctor. That's a very sharp shot. We're left with 4 minutes. Does anyone feel like they have one-liner? Lucia?
Arnold, I think Dr. Harry makes a very valid point around the question of who we are as a people and our culture. And I think Kenya is a fantastic example of the fact that the law does not change who we are as people. If we are committed to undermining the constitution, if we are committed to undermine visions in the law, does not change that. Kenya has moved to instances where we are using technology in elections. We have a fantastic Supreme Court, as some of you have said, but we are still seeing the law being used to undermine fair political practices. So the law has no capacity to change who we are on the outside. I think as evolution within ourselves as people, putting we want to hand over to future generations. With that, we don't move forward, unfortunately.
Thank you. Leah, a second. If you can speak in a Twitter like speak.
All right. Just to say that I think the whole electoral process in Africa leaves much to be desired, and I think it's time to begin to hold ourselves initially accountable and our leaders accountable, but then also these institutions that are quickly becoming white elephants accountable. I think we need to be reporting on why we're making no progress insofar as elections are concerned, because it's like we're legitimizing draconian governments, so to say.
Thank you. Mfundo, your Twitter voice.
I mean, I would say that Zimbabwe lives matter. The anti-colonial struggle in many African countries was built on solidarity, and that Zimbabweans need is much needed solidarity from our African brothers as we work on our democracy, as we prepare for elections. It's important that we get the much needed solidarity before we can even talk about the nitty-gritties of preparations for elections. Zimbabwe needs solidarity, our Zimbabwe lives matter, and I think that it's the kind of solidarity we need at this moment so that we are able to work on these minute issues of elections.
Thank you. Mr. SG or Brian, between the two of you, can you please give us closing remarks? I want to thank my panelists and the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Ms. SG.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank all our presenters, Miria, Sam, Leah, Ms. Thuo, and
it's 17 hours.
The moderator, and all those that have worked to make sure that, oh, I see Victoria too. All of you that have worked to make sure that that this meeting goes on. You said there's only half a second or something.
Yeah,
so
yeah. You've exceeded it.
So thank you very much.
Thanks to Brian and thanks Mamu and all those who worked behind the scenes. Okay, see you next time on issue number 3. Bye-bye.